Love is often praised as an unbreakable bond, a powerful force capable of overcoming any obstacle. But what happens when that love is founded on deception and hidden truths? In this tale, a night meant to mark the beginning of a beautiful future instead spirals into a nightmare of treachery and tragedy. Set in a serene, affluent neighborhood, this heartbreaking story unfolds behind the doors of what should have been a flawless wedding, where joy and excitement conceal the dark secrets lurking beneath the surface. This is the story of Derek, Leah, and Terrence, three individuals whose lives are about to be irreversibly altered by the decisions they've made and the truths they have concealed. Our story revolves around three individuals: Leah, the radiant bride; Derek, her devoted fiancé; and Terrence, his closest friend. Their lives are woven together by fate and friendship, but beneath the surface of this seemingly unbreakable bond lies a hidden truth. Derek and Terrence share a connection far deeper than anyone suspects, a connection that, on this fateful night, threatens to unravel everything. As Derek stands at the altar, he finds himself caught between the life he is about to embrace with Leah and the secret existence he has been sharing with Terrence. A truth so powerful that, once exposed, it will leave devastation in its wake. Every story has a beginning, a moment where bonds are forged, secrets take root, and lives become entangled. This story starts with a friendship, one that spans years of shared memories, laughter, and an unspoken understanding that now stands on the brink of revelation. Derek and Terrence were more than just friends, they were each other's refuge, allies in a world that often felt too vast and overwhelming to face alone. To outsiders, their relationship appeared like any other: strong, supportive, and unwavering. But beneath that familiar closeness lay something deeper, something neither of them could fully confront, let alone share with the world. As the years went by, their connection only deepened. They were inseparable, the kind of friends who could finish each other's sentences, who could understand a thought without a single word spoken. When Leah entered their lives, she was warmly welcomed into their close-knit circle. She saw two men who deeply cared for each other, and to her, their bond was proof of Derek's capacity for love and loyalty. But what she didn't see, what she couldn't see, were the fleeting moments between them. The glances that lingered a second too long, the subtle touches, the unspoken words that carried a weight she would never fully comprehend. As the wedding day drew closer, Derek wrestled with an unease he couldn't escape. He loved Leah, of that he was certain. But there was something else, something buried deep within him that had lingered in the shadows for far too long, waiting to be acknowledged. Terrence saw it too, the way Derek's smile no longer reached his eyes, the way his laughter felt strained, empty. Leah, lost in the excitement of her impending marriage, remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering just beneath the surface. But to truly grasp the depth of this story, we must go back to a time before the engagement, before the wedding preparations, to the moment when everything changed. It seemed like any other night. Derek and Terrence were alone, as they often were, unwinding after a long day. But this time, something was different. An unspoken tension hung between them, heavier than ever before. It had always been there, that quiet pull, that unacknowledged connection, but they had never dared to cross the line, until that night. A glance lingered a second too long. A touch, meant to be fleeting, carried more meaning than intended. And in that instant, the boundary that had kept them safe, that had preserved the simplicity of their friendship, crumbled. What followed was a night of uncertainty, passion, and fear. They were no longer just friends. They had become something else, something neither of them could easily define, and something they knew could never be revealed. In the days and weeks that followed, they buried their secret deep, hiding it not only from the world but from Leah as well. Yet with every stolen glance, every clandestine meeting, the weight of their deception grew heavier. Derek found himself caught between two realities: the life he had always known, the one he was expected to live, and the life he had briefly glimpsed, a love that was as intoxicating as it was terrifying. Terrence felt it too, the fear of what they had done, and an even greater fear of what would happen if the truth were ever exposed. As the wedding day approached, the tension between them became impossible to ignore. They tried to pretend that nothing had changed, that their friendship remained untouched, but they both knew better. Derek's behavior became erratic, his emotions shifting wildly, one moment filled with joy, the next gripped by despair, torn between excitement and dread. He threw himself into the wedding preparations with an almost frantic energy, surprising everyone. But those who knew him best could see the cracks beginning to form. In the days and weeks that followed, they kept their secret locked away, hidden from the world and from Leah. Yet with every stolen glance, every clandestine meeting, the burden of their deception grew heavier. Derek found himself trapped between two conflicting realities. The life he had always known, the one he was expected to embrace, and the life he had briefly tasted, a love as overwhelming as it was terrifying. Terrence felt it too, the weight of what they had done, and an even greater fear of what would happen if the truth ever surfaced. If you're hooked on this story, just wait. Things are about to take an even darker turn. Before we dive in, take a second to hit that quick to subscribe Ross button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss what's coming next. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for this. As the wedding day loomed closer, the strain between Derek and Terrence became impossible to ignore. They tried to carry on as if nothing had changed, as if their bond remained untouched. But deep down, they both knew the truth. It had. Derek's behavior grew erratic, his emotions swinging wildly between elation and despair, anticipation and dread. He immersed himself in wedding preparations with an almost desperate intensity, surprising everyone around him. But to those who truly knew him, the cracks in his facade were beginning to show. On the surface, Terrence appeared calm, composed, a steady presence amidst the whirlwind of wedding preparations. But inside, he was a storm of emotions: love, guilt, jealousy, and an unbearable sense of impending loss. Meanwhile, Leah, blissfully unaware, remained consumed by the excitement of her upcoming wedding, the dress, the flowers, the guest list. She was filled with anticipation, dreaming of the beautiful life she was about to begin with the man she adored. She didn't see the way Derek would drift into silence, staring off into the distance when he thought no one was watching. She didn't notice the slight tremor in his hands whenever he spoke about the future. She couldn't understand why, at times, he would subtly recoil from her touch, as if he were afraid, not of her, but of something else, of someone else. And then there were the moments between Derek and Terrence, small, fleeting, yet heavy with meaning. A glance that lingered a second too long, a hand that rested just a moment more than necessary, a whispered word exchanged in the quiet of a crowded room. Unseen by most, these subtle gestures spoke volumes. Volumes that, if read, could shatter everything. These moments were fleeting, slipping by in an instant, yet for those who noticed, they carried an unsettling weight, a quiet, lingering unease. Terrence was struggling just as much, trapped between his love for Derek and the looming reality of what was to come. He knew that once the vows were spoken, everything would change. Whatever they had become, whatever they had allowed themselves to be, would have to end. As the wedding day drew closer, the tension between them became unbearable. Derek found himself jolting awake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering in his chest. He would lie there, staring into the darkness, his mind racing with the choices he had made, the life he was about to step into, and the love he was about to leave behind. Terrence, ever present, remained a fixture in his life, yet between them stretched a chasm that had never been there before, a distance carved by fear, by guilt, by the unshakable truth that the world they had built, however brief, however fragile, was about to be torn apart. And so, with each passing day, the suspense mounted, the tension between Derek and Terrence becoming increasingly unbearable. The wedding day loomed ahead, a storm cloud on the horizon, dark, threatening, and poised to destroy everything in its path. Derek found himself ensnared in a web of his own making, painfully aware that no matter the choice he made, someone would inevitably be hurt. What he didn't know, however, was how much pain would follow, or how soon it would come. Finally, the wedding day arrived, the day that was supposed to be filled with happiness and celebration. Derek stood at the altar, his heart racing, not with the excitement one might expect, but with a deep, gnawing anxiety that threatened to swallow him whole. As he watched Leah approach, walking down the aisle, every step she took felt like another nail driven into the coffin of the life he thought he was meant to live. Terrence stood just a few feet away, fulfilling his role as Derek's best man, a title he had worn for years in ways that went far beyond the conventional. But today, that title carried a weight heavier than ever before. Derek's mind raced as he recited his vows, the words feeling empty and mechanical as they left his mouth. He stole a glance at Terrence, who offered a strained smile, but Derek could see the pain behind it, the quiet torment of watching the man he loved marry someone else. The ceremony continued as planned. Vows exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, and the couple officially pronounced husband and wife. But for Derek, each word, each gesture, felt like a searing reminder of the truth he had buried deep inside him, the love he could never claim, the life he could never live. At the reception, the atmosphere was filled with joy, but Derek was far from joyful. His thoughts swirled in a whirlwind of conflict and emotion, caught between the life he had just committed to and the intense, undeniable bond he shared with Terrence. Leah, radiant with happiness, remained blissfully unaware of the storm raging inside her new husband. But as the evening wore on, even she couldn't ignore the distance growing between them. His smiles were forced, his laughter hollow, and a quiet unease settled over the night, unnoticed by most but all too clear to those who truly knew him. Terrence, too, was struggling. Every congratulatory toast, every forced smile he gave, felt like a dagger piercing his heart. Throughout the night, he and Derek exchanged brief, tense glances, their shared secret hovering between them like an unspoken weight. For everyone else, the day was filled with love and celebration. But for Derek and Terrence, it was a painful, bittersweet reminder of the truth they were desperately trying to bury. As the reception began to wind down, Derek's growing unease became more noticeable. Leah, concerned, saw how distracted he seemed, his mind drifting somewhere far away. She tried to brush it off as fatigue from the day's whirlwind events, but something about his demeanor didn't sit right with her. Derek had always been the attentive, loving partner she'd known, but tonight he seemed distant, almost detached. Every time she tried to engage him, his responses were short, his gaze flitting around the room as if searching for something or someone he couldn't find. The truth was, Derek couldn't stop thinking about Terrence. The affair, sudden and unexpected, had thrown him into a state of emotional chaos. The bond they had shared in the days leading up to the wedding had sparked something intense. And now, on what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life, Derek was consumed by guilt and confusion. He tried to focus on Leah, to be the husband she deserved, but his mind kept returning to Terrence, and the guilt gnawed at him relentlessly. The weight of his double life was becoming too much to bear. As the evening stretched on, Derek's anxiety grew. He knew he needed to talk to Terrence, to confront the turmoil that had taken root inside him, but not here, not with Leah so close. Terrence, on the other hand, was fighting his own internal battle. The affair had been brief but powerful, an emotional whirlwind neither of them had been prepared for. Watching Derek with Leah was more excruciating than he had anticipated. Every smile, every touch exchanged between the newlyweds was a cruel reminder of what he could never have. Terrence could see the conflict in Derek's eyes, the way he deliberately avoided looking at Leah for too long, the way his gaze would inevitably find Terrence across the room. They had spent weeks keeping their relationship a secret, but tonight the weight of that secrecy was becoming unbearable. The tension between them was palpable, noticeable only to those who knew where to look. As the night drew to a close, Derek and Leah retired to their bridal suite. Leah, still glowing from the day's joy, looked forward to a romantic evening with her new husband, unaware of the storm swirling inside him. But Derek couldn't bring himself to fully engage. The thought of being intimate with Leah felt wrong, like he was betraying not only her, but also Terrence. He made excuses, claiming he was too exhausted from the day, that the wedding stress had drained him. Leah, though disappointed, accepted his explanation, unaware that something deeper and darker was at play. She kissed him goodnight, trying to be understanding, but the seed of doubt had already been planted in her mind. As Derek lay beside Leah, staring at the ceiling, his mind raced with thoughts he could no longer suppress. He knew he was hurting her, that she deserved more than what he could give, but he couldn't bring himself to pretend anymore. The guilt, the fear, the love he felt for Terrence, it was all too overwhelming. He couldn't sleep. His thoughts were too loud, too consuming. After what felt like an eternity of restless tossing and turning, Derek made a decision. He needed to talk to Terrence. He needed to confront the mess they had created, and perhaps if they could just talk, he could find some semblance of clarity. Maybe then he could settle his tortured mind, find some peace, and figure out how to move forward from this tangled web of love and lies. Unable to sleep, Derek quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Leah. The hotel hallways were dark and silent, the stillness amplifying the chaos inside him. As he walked toward Terrence's room, his heart hammered in his chest, not with anticipation, but with fear. He needed to talk to Terrence, to find some way to resolve the tension that had been building between them for weeks. The closer he got to the door, the heavier his steps became, as if his body was trying to stop him from going any further. When he finally knocked on Terrence's door, the pause before it opened felt like an eternity. Terrence stood in the doorway, his eyes mirroring the turmoil Derek felt. He was dressed only in his underwear, the vulnerability of the moment stark, raw, and undeniable. Neither of them needed to speak. They both knew exactly why Derek had come. Derek stepped inside, the door closing behind him with a sense of finality that made his heart drop. They sat down together, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Derek tried to begin the conversation, to address what had happened, to find a way to move forward without destroying everything. But the words wouldn't come. The room was heavy with silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, unable to bridge the chasm of tension that stretched between them. Finally, Derek spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He confessed his love for Terrence, admitting that he couldn't let go, that he didn't know how to move forward with Leah while his heart still belonged to someone else. He asked Terrence the same question he had been asking himself. What were they supposed to do now? But before they could find any answers, the emotions that had been building all night finally erupted. The overwhelming need to feel something, to find some kind of release from the pain and confusion, overtook them. In a moment of weakness, they gave in to the desire that had been simmering beneath the surface. The affair, which had started only recently, unfolded in the darkness of Terrence's room. Both men were fully aware of the consequences, but neither could stop themselves. It was a brief, desperate attempt to hold on to something they knew was slipping away. But just as quickly as it had begun, it was over, leaving both of them with a heavier burden of guilt and dread. Derek pulled away, his mind swirling with thoughts of Leah, of the life he had just promised her, and of the uncertain future that now seemed impossible to navigate. As the reality of what they had done began to sink in, Derek knew he couldn't go back to the bridal suite, couldn't face Leah with the crushing weight of what had just happened. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head buried in his hands, trying to make sense of how everything had gone so terribly wrong. Terrence, too, was lost in thought, grappling with the understanding that they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The night, which had started with such hope and promise, had turned into a nightmare from which neither of them could escape. Meanwhile, in the bridal suite, Leah stirred in her sleep. She reached out for Derek, but when her hand brushed the cold, empty side of the bed, she jolted awake. Panic set in as she realized he wasn't there. She called his name, her voice trembling, but there was no response. Her heart pounded as she quickly slipped out of bed, pulling on her robe. The hotel was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft echo of her footsteps as she hurried through the hallway. A sense of dread began to fill her, and with each step she took, her mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Leah's intuition led her to Terrence's room. She hesitated for a moment outside the door, a knot forming in her stomach as she raised her hand to knock. She knocked once. Silence. She knocked again, this time harder, her heart pounding in her chest. Still nothing. With each unanswered knock, her anxiety deepened, her mind spiraling with fear and suspicion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open. Terrence stood there, his eyes wide with surprise and guilt, dressed only in his underwear. The sight was enough to send a shockwave through Leah. She didn't need to see Derek to know what had happened. The truth, which had been lurking in the shadows, was now glaring at her, undeniable and devastating. The man she had just married, the man she thought she knew, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. And in that moment, Leah's world came crashing down. The door creaked open wider, and Leah stood frozen in the doorway, her mind struggling to process the scene before her. Terrence, standing there in his underwear, guilt etched all over his face. And just beyond him, Derek, her husband of only a few hours, was seated on the edge of the bed, his face a mask of shame and despair. The truth that had been gnawing at the edges of Leah's consciousness now slammed into her with full force. Betrayal, humiliation, and rage surged through her in a tidal wave, too powerful to control. Leah's voice trembled as she demanded answers, her words sharp, venomous, and filled with the anguish of someone whose entire life had just been ripped apart. Derek, feeling trapped and frantic, struggled to speak, but his voice failed him. Terrence, just as shaken, stood frozen, helplessly witnessing the situation unravel. Leah's fury surged, her hands trembling as she pointed an accusing finger at Derek, her voice rising with each word, thick with anger and betrayal. The pain cut deeper than she had ever imagined, and with every passing second, it twisted into something darker, something far more dangerous. Overcome with emotion, Leah lunged at Derek, her rage fueling her every move. The room exploded into chaos, the tension that had simmered all night finally breaking apart. Derek fought to restrain her, his voice pleading for her to stop, but she refused to hear him. The betrayal had fractured something within her, something irreparable. Terrence, torn between his love for Derek and the crushing weight of his own guilt, could do nothing but stand by, paralyzed as the confrontation spiraled beyond control. The moment reached a breaking point as Leah, consumed by blinding rage, grabbed the closest object, a heavy, ornate lamp, and swung it with all her might. The room was swallowed by a shocked silence as the lamp struck Derek's head, the force of the impact sending him collapsing to the floor. Blood spread rapidly beneath him, and for a fleeting moment, time seemed to stand still. Terrence dropped to his knees beside Derek, his hands trembling as he frantically tried to stop the bleeding, but it was already too late. The damage had been done, and Derek's lifeless eyes stared blankly, the horror of the moment sinking in with suffocating finality. Leah remained motionless, the weight of her actions settling over her like a suffocating fog. Yet the rage had not completely faded. Overcome by grief and madness, she turned her fury onto Terrence, holding him responsible for everything, for the betrayal, the destruction of the life she had only just begun to build. The pain, the shame, the unbearable loss all collided in her mind, and before she could stop herself, she lashed out once more, her hands driven by a desperate, uncontrollable urge to put an end to the nightmare. The atmosphere in the room grew chaotic as Leah's grief and rage overwhelmed her. Her voice cracked with pain as she confronted the men who had shattered her world. Terrence, caught off guard, barely had time to react before the fury of Leah's emotions took hold. The room filled with the sound of her sobs, desperate and raw, as the weight of the betrayal hit her like a tidal wave. Terrence, paralyzed by the situation, could see the end was near, but he was powerless to stop the onslaught of her anger. The second blow landed, swift and unforgiving, and Terrence crumpled to the ground, collapsing next to Derek. The room grew eerily quiet, save for the ragged breaths and the unsettling silence that followed. Blood from both men pooled on the floor, mixing with the reality of the irrevocable choices they had made. And then silence. A dense, suffocating stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly, mirroring the irrevocable nature of what had just transpired. Leah stood motionless in the center of the room, her breaths ragged and uneven, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of her actions. The lamp slipped from her grasp, crashing to the floor beside the two lifeless bodies that had once been her husband and his closest friend. The weight of her actions struck her like a physical force, the grim reality settling over her with an unforgiving clarity. Panic surged through her as she dropped to her knees beside Derek, her hands trembling violently as she reached for him, shaking him desperately, as if willing him to wake would somehow undo it all. But Derek remained still, his unseeing eyes fixed on the ceiling. And as the truth of what she had done crashed down on her, An overwhelming wave of horror consumed her. Her cries escalated, raw and desperate, as the crushing truth set in. There was no undoing what had happened. The man she had loved, the one she had promised to spend forever with, was gone, taken by her own hands in a fit of uncontrollable rage. Beside him, Terence lay still, his face frozen in an expression of shock and fear, his body just as cold. Leah's mind spiraled, her thoughts colliding in a frantic search for a way out, a solution, anything that could erase the nightmare unfolding before her. Her wild eyes darted around the room, seeking something, anything that could make it all disappear. But there was nothing, no escape, no undoing the horror she had unleashed. The blood on her hands, on the floor, on the walls, it was real, unforgiving, final. In her despair, she lunged at the mess, scrubbing frantically at the blood, her sobs ricocheting off the walls. But it was futile. The stains wouldn't fade, and with each frantic motion, the truth loomed larger, suffocating her. The room, once a space of warmth and celebration, had transformed into something unrecognizable. A crime scene drenched in betrayal, its love twisted and shattered beyond repair. Drained and shattered, Leah crumpled to the floor beside Derek and Terence, her body racked with uncontrollable sobs. The weight of her actions, the enormity of her loss, settled over her like a suffocating shroud. She was alone now, completely and utterly alone, with nothing but the haunting echoes of her own choices to surround her. The consequences of what she had done, the life she had destroyed, bore down on her with relentless force, leaving only one question lingering in the hollow silence. What now? As the first pale rays of dawn seeped through the curtains, Leah understood that there was no escaping what was to come. Whether she would flee or surrender, she couldn't yet decide. But one truth was undeniable. Her life, once brimming with love and promise, had been irreversibly shattered, reduced to ruins by a single, violent night. A night that had begun with dreams of forever had ended in a tragedy too terrible to comprehend. What was meant to be a joyous celebration of love, commitment, and a fresh beginning instead descended into a night of betrayal, violence, and irreversible loss. The wedding, once a beacon of hope and unity, now lies in ruins, its laughter replaced by sorrow, its sacred vows eclipsed by the dark truths that unraveled them. The once vibrant venue, now a crime scene, stands empty, bearing only the echoes of shattered dreams and stolen futures. Leah, the bride who had once envisioned a life overflowing with love and devotion, now sits alone, her tear-streaked face a stark reflection of the unbearable grief and regret that crushes her spirit. This was a night where love twisted into hatred, trust crumbled beneath the weight of betrayal, and life was cruelly taken by the very hands that had once vowed to cherish and protect. Looking back on this tragic night, we are forced to confront the deeper implications of this harrowing tale. Derek, Terence, and Leah were all casualties, not just of their own choices, but of the suffocating pressures, hidden desires, and unspoken truths they carried. The very secrets they sought to bury, veiled in shame and fear, became the inevitable force that led to their ruin. This story lays bare the fragile and often tumultuous nature of the human condition, how we grapple with love, loyalty, and identity in a world that demands we conform, even at the expense of our true selves. It speaks to the suffocating weight of societal expectations, the impossible choices we make between authenticity and the roles we are forced to play. The wedding rings, once gleaming symbols of unity and promise, now lie abandoned, broken emblems of a bond that was never as strong as it seemed. And in the midst of the wreckage stands Leah, stripped of everything, forced to confront the unbearable cost of choices made in pain and fury. This story compels us to examine the devastating impact of betrayal, the suffocating burden of secrets, and the tragic consequences of living a life that is not entirely our own. It is a haunting reminder of how quickly love can curdle into hatred and how fragile trust becomes when built upon hidden truths too painful to reveal. The events of this night serve as a warning of how deception, unspoken desires, and unresolved emotions can unravel even the strongest of bonds, leaving nothing behind but regret and ruin. As the screen fades to black, we leave you with this final thought. In a world where truth is often buried beneath layers of deception, what price do we pay for living a life that is not true to who we are? And when those secrets inevitably surface, who ultimately bears the cost? This is a story of love lost, trust shattered, and lives forever changed. A story that lingers long after the last word is spoken, compelling us to reflect on the choices we make, the paths we follow, and the people we become. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell to stay updated with more content like this. As the screen fades to black, we leave you with this final thought. In a world where truth is often buried beneath layers of deception, what price do we pay for living a life that is not true to who we are? And when those secrets inevitably surface, who ultimately bears the cost? This is a story of love lost, trust shattered, and lives forever changed. A story that lingers long after the last word is spoken, compelling us to reflect on the choices we make, the paths we follow, and the people we become. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell to stay updated with more content like this.